I want to tell you about two families I could never stop thinking about. They both lived in Dallas. They both made almost the same money, and from the outside, they both looked successful. Kevin and Maria did what most of us dream about. They bought the big house, 4 bedrooms, formal dining room, extra space for the future, the kind of house that makes your relatives go quiet for a second when they walk in. James and Patricia did something that honestly looked underwhelming. They bought the smaller house, still nice, still safe, still in a good neighborhood, but every time people visited, there was always some version of the same comment. Wait, with what you guys make, couldn't you afford something nicer? And that sentence right there, that sentence ruins people because it sounds harmless, but hidden inside it is one of the most expensive psychological traps in America. For a long time, I thought the bigger house meant you were winning. I thought more square footage meant more proof, more maturity, more success, more arrival. But fast forward 10 years, and the scoreboard looked completely different. Kevin and Maria had the beautiful house. The pictures were amazing. Holidays looked expensive. Their life photographed well. But underneath it all, there was stress. Constant low-grade stress. They had about $140,000 saved for retirement, and every financial decision still felt tight. James and Patricia? They had around $620,000 in retirement savings. They spent one summer in Portugal. They talked about time differently. They made decisions from calm, not panic. Same city, similar income, totally different ending. And the reason is the part nobody warns you about. The bigger house is one of the most efficient wealth killers in modern life because it never feels like a mistake. It feels like progress. It feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels like you're finally becoming the version of yourself you were supposed to become. That's why this trap is so dangerous. Nobody buys the bigger house thinking, this will quietly destroy my flexibility for the next 20 years. No, you buy it thinking, we earned this. And maybe that's the most expensive sentence in the middle class. Hi, I am Harvey, and in this video, I want to show you the hidden math, the emotional trap, the long game, and the part nobody says out loud. The house you buy in your 30s can decide what your 60s feel like. Here's where I messed this up for years. I thought the mortgage was the cost of the house. It's not. The mortgage is just the headline. The real cost is buried in the fine print of your lifestyle. A typical homeowner in the US is now dealing with more than $21,000 a year in ongoing hidden ownership costs, and the biggest chunk isn't even the glamorous stuff, it's maintenance. Bankrate's 2025 study puts average annual maintenance costs at about $8,808, with additional pressure coming from property taxes, utilities, insurance, and internet and cable. Zillow makes the same point from another angle. The real monthly burden goes well beyond principal and interest and can include taxes, insurance, HOA dues, utilities, and constant upkeep. That's why I started thinking about housing with what I call the 60% rule. The mortgage payment, that's maybe half to 60% of the true cost you end up emotionally organizing your life around. The rest sneaks in through the side door. Property taxes, insurance, repairs, bigger utility bills, furniture, appliances, landscaping, and the silent killer, the expectation that everything around the house now has to match the house. Let me show you how this starts. Say one family buys a $300,000 home and another buys a $500,000 home in Texas. Using Texas's average effective property tax rate of 1.31%, the smaller home would generate roughly $3,930 a year in property taxes, while the larger home would be around $6,550. That's a gap of about $2,620 every single year, before we've even talked about repairs or upgrades. Now, let's talk maintenance, because this is where the house stops being a symbol and starts becoming a machine you have to feed. Most personal finance guidance says you should budget roughly 1 to 2% of the home's value each year for routine maintenance. That means a $300,000 house may need $3,000 to $6,000 a year, while a $500,000 house can easily mean $5,000 to $10,000 a year. Bigger roof, bigger HVAC, more exterior to paint, more flooring to replace, more windows to leak, more things to break on a random Tuesday when your cash flow is already spoken for. And then comes the part nobody puts in the mortgage calculator. A bigger house creates a bigger stage. Empty rooms don't stay empty. They become projects. They become, we should really do something with this space. They become rugs, sectionals, shelves, lighting, patio sets, guest beds, wall art, storage systems, and just making it feel finished. Even furnishing guides aimed at regular homeowners admit that fully furnishing a house often runs $10,000 to $30,000 or more, with larger homes pushing the number much higher simply because more square footage creates more spending opportunities. And the lifestyle anchoring doesn't stop inside the house. A bigger house quietly starts voting on your behalf. It suggests what car belongs in the driveway, what vacations are normal for your social circle, what school expectations feel non-negotiable, what kind of weekends people like us are supposed to have. So when I say the bigger house costs more, I don't just mean the bill. I mean it rewrites your identity overhead. Now imagine the hidden cost gap between the modest home and the dream home is $1,400 a month. Not just mortgage difference, total hidden drag. If that $1,400 were invested monthly at 8%, it grows to roughly $1.33 million over 25 years. That's the part that changed me, because suddenly the question isn't, can I afford the bigger house? It's, what future am I deleting in order to live in it now? Let me tell you the story the way I wish someone had told it to me. Two people start at age 23, same ambition, same discipline, same starting cash, $11,200, but they choose different obsessions. On path A, the buyer becomes laser focused on home ownership as fast as possible. He tells himself he's being serious, mature, strategic. He starts stacking cash for a down payment. On path B, the investor does something that looks way less impressive at first. He automates money into index funds. No dramatic milestone, no keys, no closing day, no champagne photo in front of a sold sign, just boring monthly contributions that nobody claps for. From 25 to 29, the buyer saves about $1,100 a month for the down payment. He feels productive because the goal is visible, tangible, socially rewarded. The investor also moves money every month, but his money disappears into a black box called later. It doesn't get him validation. It doesn't get him compliments. Nobody comes over and says, "Wow, your brokerage account feels so spacious." And that's why this next part matters. At 29, on paper, they may look surprisingly similar. The buyer has a big pile of cash, maybe some starter equity, maybe a house under contract, maybe a freshly closed purchase that makes him feel like he just became an adult overnight. The investor has a portfolio. But here's the difference nobody talks about. The buyer's money is now earmarked for one transaction. The investor's money is still liquid, flexible, mobile, alive. One is trapped in a purchase. The other is still a weapon. And then life starts acting like life. At 31, the water heater dies. At 32, the fence needs work. At 33, insurance jumps. At 34, property taxes get reassessed. At 35, there's always one sentence hanging in the air. We didn't plan for this. That's home ownership's real personality. Not the closing day, not the keys, not the empty kitchen photo. Its real personality is the invoice. Meanwhile, the investor's path is emotionally harder but financially cleaner. While the buyer is absorbing random housing shocks, the investor keeps feeding the machine. Contributions go in, time passes, markets do what markets do, compounding stays invisible until it doesn't. And one day, almost unfairly, the numbers start to look ridiculous. The portfolio that once looked boring starts crossing levels the buyer thought only happened to finance people. A few $100,000, then more, then the annual growth alone starts feeling surreal. This is the strange part of compounding. It feels fake for a long time, then it feels unstoppable.
Now, here comes the twist, and I need to be honest about it. By 40, the buyer can finally start getting a real structural advantage. Because once the mortgage is locked and income rises over time, a homeowner's monthly housing cost can become more stable than rent. That part is real. That part matters, and it's why homeownership can absolutely work. But people misunderstand what kind of win it is. The win is not buy the biggest house possible. The win is secure shelter costs without suffocating your investing life. Because if the investor reaches 40 with, say, a $1.5 million portfolio, then at 8%, the portfolio might grow by roughly $120,000 in a strong year without him lifting a finger. Even a more conservative framing makes the point. When your money begins generating annual growth that rivals or exceeds many salaries, you are playing a completely different game. That's the crossover moment. The buyer has lower housing costs than rising rent. The investor has a machine printing optionality. And that's why this is not a simplistic rent good, buy bad story. No, this is a story about how much house you buy. Because the modest buyer can get the best of both worlds, stable shelter and enough margin to keep investing. That's the golden path. Not maximum approval, maximum margin. The buyer loses when the house eats the investing habit. The buyer wins when the house protects the investing habit. That one sentence can save people a decade. Now, let's zoom out, because this gets bigger than personal finance. For years, I thought the system pushes homeownership because it's morally good. That's not really it. The system pushes homeownership because a lot of powerful institutions benefit when you believe property only goes one direction. And to be fair, for wealthy people, real estate really can be incredible, but not in the way normal people do it. Rich investors don't buy a stretched primary residence and hope the granite countertops rescue their retirement. They use real estate like a tool. They use depreciation, which means they can sometimes make real cash while reporting losses on paper. The IRS allows residential rental property to be depreciated over 27.5 years under the general system, which is a huge reason investment property behaves differently for the wealthy than a personal home behaves for the average family. They use leverage differently too. A wealthy investor might put $1 million down to control $5 million worth of property, then let tenants, tax treatment, and long-term appreciation do the heavy lifting. That is not the same game as buying a primary home at the edge of your affordability and praying nothing expensive happens for 6 years. And now there's another shift happening that makes this even more uncomfortable. You're not just competing with neighbors anymore, you're competing with systems. The U.S. Government Accountability Office says institutional investors expanded aggressively after the financial crisis, aided by easier access to capital and technology, and studies they reviewed found these investors may have contributed to higher home prices and rents in some markets. And this isn't theoretical. Companies like Opendoor operate at a scale normal buyers simply can't. In Q1 2025, Opendoor reported $98 million in sales, marketing, and operations expense, $2.362 billion in inventory, and activity across 50 markets. Whether you love or hate the model, the message is clear. You are increasingly in a market where capital, algorithms, and institutional speed are real competitors. And then there's government. Local governments depend heavily on property taxes. Research summarized by Urban Institute notes that in most cities, property taxes are a primary source of local revenue, which means city finances are deeply tied to housing values and foreclosure patterns. When housing markets crack, municipal budgets feel it too. So when I say the system wants you to buy, I don't mean there's a secret room with villains in suits. I mean the incentives are stacked in one direction. Banks like mortgages, cities like strong tax bases, investors like appreciating assets. The culture likes visible success, and you, standing in the middle of that machine, are told that the responsible thing is to stretch. But stretching for an asset is not the same as building wealth from it. That confusion costs people decades. So let's go back to Kevin and Maria, and James and Patricia, because this is where the whole thing lands. At 62, Kevin and Maria have the house everybody admired. It still looks impressive, it still photographs beautifully, it still signals all the right things. But their life is tighter than it should be. They are what a lot of people become without realizing it. House rich, cash poor.
They have a valuable asset, but not enough freedom, so retirement feels less like a finish line and more like a negotiation. Maybe a few more years, maybe part-time, maybe after the next refinance, maybe after the market improves, maybe after they downsize, maybe. Now look at James and Patricia. The smaller house got fewer compliments, it generated less envy, it gave them less to show off, but it gave them something better: margin. Margin to invest, margin to breathe, margin to absorb shocks, margin to say yes to experiences, margin to let time work for them instead of against them. That's the word I wish more people optimized for in their 30s. Not image, not status, not what will people think when they walk in. Margin. Because margin becomes peace. Margin becomes options. Margin becomes retirement. Margin becomes summers in Portugal instead of more years in fluorescent lighting. So here's the strategy I believe now. If you buy a home, buy 60 to 70% of what the bank says you can afford. Not because you're playing small, but because you understand the game. The bank is underwriting your payment, you are underwriting your life, and those are not the same calculation. Second, treat your primary home as a consumption choice first. Yes, it can build equity. Yes, it can stabilize housing costs. Yes, it can be a smart move, but don't lie to yourself. The home you live in is also where your money goes to relax, expand, decorate, leak, crack, age, and demand attention. A primary residence can support wealth. It is not automatically wealth creation. Third, optimize for outcomes, not appearances. When you zoom all the way out, nobody remembers the square footage. They remember whether you were free, whether you were present, whether you were stressed, whether you were always working, whether money sat like tension in the room, whether you had time, whether you had choices. That's the real flex, not the bigger house, the calmer life. So if you're standing at that fork in the road right now, the dream house on one side, the intentional house on the other, I want you to hear this clearly. The house you buy in your 30s determines your retirement more than almost any other choice. A modest home purchased with intention beats a large home purchased with aspiration every single time. And if that sounds unglamorous, good, because most financial peace looks boring in the beginning. That's why so few people choose it. I used to think the bigger house meant I was moving up. Now I think the best house is the one that lets your future keep breathing. Subscribe to Harvey Finance because the goal isn't to look wealthy, it's to become financially free.